A soldier once told his wife, "Army life is 99% boredom and 1% sheer terror." For the average Civil War soldier, the majority of his time, especially during the winter months, was spent in camp. For the Second Vermont Brigade, things were no different. During the winter and spring of 1863, many camped here at Wolf Run Shawls. Their charge was picket duty along the Occoquan and Bull Run River. In this segment, we'll look at camp life in the Army.
In early November 1862, the newly formed Second Vermont Brigade, nearly 5,000 strong, marched proudly down Pennsylvania Avenue to the tune of "The Girl I Left Behind." They crossed Long Bridge over the Potomac River into Virginia, where for the first time they were in enemy territory. They passed Arlington Heights, from which they viewed the former home of Confederate General Robert E. Lee, then occupied by Federal troops and now the site of the Arlington National Cemetery. They eventually set up camp in South Alexandria on the road to Mount Vernon.
Camp Vermont was indeed a beautiful spot, on an elevated table of land overlooking a broad stretch of the Potomac Valley from Washington to Mount Vernon, with wooded hills and fertile valleys of Maryland to the east, the still running waters of the Potomac at our feet.
During the winter months, the soldiers performed picket duty and served on work details building barracks and log huts.
1,500 men are detailed from this brigade daily to work on forts, have paid a visit to Fort Lyons, which is said to be the largest in the defense of Washington, and is garrisoned by 500 men. Corporal J.C. Williams.
This fort-building business the boys resented, saying they were ready to fight, but digging Virginia clay in mud and water was not in the contract.
Private William Henry Jackson of the 12th Vermont was part of these details. Jackson, a native of Rutland, Vermont, drew many sketches like this one depicting life as it was in the Army. It was through Jackson's work that we see details of everyday life for the Vermonters. About November 7th, the 14th, 15th, and 16th Regiments marched in a Vermont-like snowstorm to Alexandria from Camp Vermont to exchange their rifles.
We received in exchange for our old Belgian guns, which will kill at both ends, and endangering alike both the persons in front and back with the Austrian musket. Corporal J.C. Williams.
The rifle was one of the soldiers' most important tools and required many hours of practice to be proficient.
If we're practiced and know our job well, we can get off 3 shots a minute. That's about the best somebody can do. And that is hard to do if somebody else is shooting back at you.
In December 1862, the brigade reluctantly left Camp Vermont for locations along the Occoquan and Bull Run rivers. The brigade performed picket duty from Centerville to the famous stone bridge at the Bull Run battlefield, and south along the Bull Run and Occoquan rivers to the village of Occoquan. In addition, it stood guard duty along the Orange and Alexandria Railroad line.
Picket duty was exceedingly boring and hated by almost everybody, if not everybody, and could be dangerous. You're out there by yourself in the pitch black night, many times with the rain or snow or sleet coming down. It was not fun.
When not on picket duty, the regiments drilled for hours at a time or worked in fatigue details, often in the rain and snow. The men often played cards, dominoes, checkers, and chess to relieve the boredom. To improve the situation, men found different diversions.
A new brigade band of 17 pieces has been organized under the leadership of Mr. Clark of St. Johnsbury. The music for dress parade tonight was furnished by the band and was a decidedly attractive feature. J.C. Williams, 14th Vermont.
Not everyone joined the band, nor were all diversions safe. Private Henry Stevens Wiley of Sharon, Vermont, and his companions decided to play a trick on the soldiers traveling in the trains. The Vermont soldiers knew that Confederates used Quaker guns made of logs to make the Union Army believe that they had more cannon than they actually had. Wiley and the other soldiers built their Quaker gun using an old gun carriage, a log, and made plans for their game.
The game was to try to make them think the enemy had captured our post and was going to take the train. When it was near enough to suit us, we began to prepare for action. Our shirts of different colors, we thought we might pass as a party of Confederates. When the train was in striking distance, we went through the maneuvers of loading our Quaker cannon. The guard was plainly getting excited and seemed to be getting ready for action. The officer in command jumped up and drew his saber. When the train passed through the deep cut, we were all on the bank swinging our caps and shouting for all we were worth. We couldn't hear what the officer and the engineer were saying on account of the rumble of the train, but judging from their looks and gestures, their remarks were not complimentary, to say the least. I have often thought that it was a careless play, and it was providence that we didn't get a volley from the guard.
Happily, members of one regiment often met friends from home assigned to other units.
H. Russell and C.M. Russell, Davenport and Chandler came to camp. They were very glad to see the boys, but were not any more so than the boys were to see them. Danforth Whiting, 16th Vermont.
At this camp, the wives of Burton Dean and James Kinsley of Company K and some others joined their husbands and remained until we moved to Fairfax Courthouse.
Wives were invited down. Officers' wives would stay entire winter. Mary Farnham, Roswell Farnham, Colonel of the 12th, a good case in point. She went and spent the entire winter with Roswell down in Virginia.
It was very unusual in what I've researched to have enlisted men's wives join them during the winter, but on occasion they did. And from what I've seen, usually when the enlisted men's wives were there, they worked as washerwomen or they were in a working capacity because the enlisted men just weren't making the kind of money to allow their wives to come down there and just live with them.
Soldiers often found visitors to be one of a slithery nature.
In the morning, we discovered black snakes crawling around, evidently having been warming up by many of the campfires. They were not agreeable bedfellows, but said to be harmless. They were 6 to 8 feet long, and some of us preferred Johnny Reb in camp instead.
Time was well spent writing letters home. Chandler M. Russell of Wilmington wrote a book of poems describing his experiences and feelings.
A soldier's grave, patriot in thy narrow bed, warfare raging in thy head. Thou who at thy country's call gave up life, home, loved ones all. Over thy grave shall thousands weep, unmolested, quiet sleep. Sleep, but soon a mighty nation, with recovered right of station, shall will lion's wrath assailing, all resistance unavailing. Sweep with an avenging hand every traitor from the land. Sleep, thine was a death of glory. Sleep, thine was a mournful story. Shrined in every loyal heart, shall thy memory never depart. Chandler Russell, 16th Vermont Regiment.
Many of the Vermonters had never been outside their state prior to joining the Army, so to them, this was an adventure. Danforth Whiting of Wilmington wrote his impressions of Washington.
Started from station at 7 a.m. and got to Washington at 10. Visited the Capitol till 2. The Capitol's the largest building I ever saw. Covers 3.5 acres of ground and 751 feet 6 inches in length. Then the Smithsonian Institute, which contains every natural curiosity, and the Patent Office, and the White House, Treasury Building. I attended Grover's Theater, liked it very much. Through at 11 p.m. and put up at the Union Hotel. Danforth Whiting, 16th Vermont.
While some enjoyed the sights of Washington, others enjoyed the company of the opposite sex.
One of our corporals played with the fancy women in Washington. He has not been able to do his duty for some weeks and has at last gone to the post hospital. It is shameful for a man to abuse himself in that fashion, but thousands do.
Soldiers often had to cook for themselves. A meal could consist of fresh meat and vegetables. However, when on the march or on picket duty, a meal could consist of cold meat and a biscuit made of flour and water known as hardtack. In addition to being very hard, hardtack could contain some unwanted surprises.
Some of us soaked our hardtack in coffee before attempting to eat it, and from habit examined our coffee to see that there were no worms in the bottom of the cup.
Packages from home supplemented the soldiers' rations. What they couldn't get from home could be supplied by the regimental sutler. Commodities could include such things as tobacco, condensed milk, butter, and cheese. Because the cost of these items were so high, many soldiers bought on credit and on payday gave their pay to the sutler, leaving them with nothing.
To be a regimental sutler in winter quarters when the boys were frequently paid off was a lucrative business. The sales were enormous and the profits large. The sutlers seldom followed where it was dangerous or were liable to be gobbled up by raiders. They were not soldiers, but parasites, in fact, of the army, ever diligent in reaching out for the few dollars allowed the soldier for their arduous service.
Foraging was another way of supplementing their rations.
Comrade Woodcock came into camp one day with a pig under his arm. Colonel Randall saw him and called him to account and asked him if he had forgotten the order about shooting pigs, and he said no. But this is no pig, but a rabbit. The colonel said, "No fooling, and you may report to headquarters immediately." The result was that the colonel had some of that rabbit for his dinner the next day and asked the cook where he got that fine pig and ordered him to send for more. This illustrates one side of the colonel's character and why the boys thought so much of him. Sergeant Charles E. Shepard, 13th Vermont.
The day before Thanksgiving, being anxious to have a chicken pie, we went out among the nearby farms and tried to buy some chickens, but none were sold. But the next day, a number of good-sized chicken pies were served in good old Vermont style, and we were satisfied. But the natives were mad and came to camp. But no one had seen or heard of chickens, though feathers were plenty could be seen around camp. Most of these nearby farmers were rebels, and we had little respect for them or their chickens. John Kimball Cross, 13th Vermont.
Alcohol also found its way into camp. Danforth White of Wilmington, Vermont, in his diary entry of March 18th, summed up the results.
Whiskey dealt out. Boys merry.
On December 7th, the brigade learned that Colonel Asa Blunt, who commanded the brigade and was respected, was to be replaced by the newly promoted Brigadier General Edwin Stoughton. Stoughton, a graduate of West Point, was just 24 years old at the time of his promotion and may have been the youngest general in the Union Army. Stoughton hadn't gained the men's respect at Brattleboro, and that didn't change when he became the brigade commander.
If our brigadier possesses the necessary qualifications for a general, then drinking and swearing are the chief requisites.
No little sensation has been produced by the arrest of several officers and privates for not dressing and washing and stepping and saluting and other smaller things, just according to the stern military rules. So we are under the eye of the general.
Even though the Second Vermont was not involved in any large battles while camped along the Occoquan and Bull Run rivers, they faced rebel soldiers and sympathizers on numerous occasions.
I crossed the Occoquan River in a ferry boat. I came across a young rebel and made him prisoner alone. Returning to our camp, I delivered my prisoner to Colonel Randall, who sent the man to Washington, D.C. The prisoner informed me when I delivered him up that he wished he had shot me. Augustus Chantel, 13th Vermont. When at Wolf Run Shoals Camp, we had many days and nights out on the picket line, up and down the Occoquan River. The Rebs often came down our line to see what we were doing and who we were. Bushwhacker Mosby and his gang were out most every night to break through our picket line somewhere, and that kept us on the watch day and night. Mosby got over a number of times and stole some forage and other stuff that had been sent to us from Alexandria on the cars. But he was off before we could catch him. Corporal Eli T. Marsh.
The girls were a little reserved and shy, had evidently seen and heard of the Bluecoats before, and quite probable some had lovers in the rebel army. These Southern girls were most bitter towards those who wore the uniform of a soldier, and evidently true and loyal to the cause of the Confederacy. Our boys, as a rule, were courteous and well behaved to the dwellers thereabouts, and paid well in good money for what they had.
While scouting south of the Occoquan, 13th Regiment member William Bacchus of Stoughton, Vermont, stopped at the house and spoke with a lady rebel. She readily voiced her opinion and said that Grant would never take Vicksburg. Bacchus, who loved poetry, borrowed a book of Tom Moore's poems and said in parting, "When I bring this book back, I hope to bring you a paper containing the account of the capture of Vicksburg." But the regiment was ordered to march before Vicksburg fell. Bacchus, being an honorable man, decided to return the book. When he had nearly reached the house, he saw rebel cavalrymen, and they saw him.
Hey, look, boys, a damn Yankee! Let's get him, boys!
He turned and ran, but left the book on a fence post. The rebels fired at him while in pursuit, but gave up the chase when they reached the swamp. Bacchus finally reached the Occoquan and managed to arrive in camp just as the regiment was preparing to leave on the march. Soldiers were ordered not to steal from local residents, especially Union sympathizers. But theft occurred all the same, with fence rails being very popular.
Captain sent me to the guardhouse at 4 p.m. for bringing a rail from where we were shooting. The human wretch kept me there until tat-2 without overcoat or supper. Danforth White, 16th Vermont.
For most of Vermont's soldiers, it was the first time they had encountered slaves and slavery. For many, it was an eye-opening experience.
The dirty, filthy conditions of the streets in Alexandria is not only discoverable in all southern cities, but exhibits very plainly the blighting effects of slavery. Much has been said by slaveholders and pro-slavery men of the North about the Negro being stamped with the marks of physical and intellectual inferiority. But what little I have seen of them here disproves the statement. I find them possessed with intelligence far beyond my expectations. Corporal J.C. Williams.
The constant moving of camps added to the frustration of bad weather and sickness.
When all our tents were fixed up and we settled down for the winter, sure that we were to remain, to our surprise and great disappointment, an order came to pack up and march. This was business and no use of asking questions. We obeyed and soon were on the march in the rain and mud.
In the wintertime, they had to have more than their tents. And certainly, they were not adequate. Winters are cold in Northern Virginia. Not the snowfall that we have, but they're still cold. And they would build a shelter and then put their tent halves on top of it for a roof. And this was fine, and they'd be all set up, and then a general someplace would decide they needed to move 3 miles and had to leave their warm shelters and start all over again.
On December 28th, the soldiers learned that Confederate General Jeb Stuart, commanding a large cavalry force, crossed Union lines. Stuart's force had caused Union pickets near Wolf Run Shawls to retreat back to Fairfax Station. Expecting an attack on Fairfax Station or Fairfax Courthouse, General Stoughton ordered troops to that area. Around 7 p.m. on December 29th, some companies of the 12th Vermont moved to a location about a half-mile beyond Fairfax Courthouse. Corporal J.C. Williams remembers.
We had been in these positions but a short time when the enemy's cavalry made their appearance, driving the pickets and coming unexpectedly upon 2 companies of the 12th Vermont, upon whom they charged. The 2 companies fired a volley at them, killing 2 horses and capturing another horse and 2 prisoners. None of our boys were hurt. The squad that charged fell back to where the larger force was stationed in the woods and built fires. General Stoughton sent a flag of truce there, stating he would like an interview with General Stuart, who replied that he would correspond in the morning. General Stoughton, desiring an immediate interview, ordered a few shells to be thrown among them, which made them skedaddle, and they were not seen or heard of again that night. January 1st, 1863. A happy new year to all, but alas, this cannot be for all, for too many houses are desolate. A nation is mourning the loss of her sons who have fallen in battle. There are many families which 1 year ago were joyous and happy, now mourning the loss of some of its members by means of this cruel civil war.
Things were not well for the North at the start of 1863. The previous year had dealt them many losses. The defeat at Fredericksburg, with a loss of 15,000 men, left the nation under a heavy cloud of gloom. Much of the brigade lost faith in their commanders.
There is great rejoicing in camp at reports contradicting the one that McClellan has been appointed to the command of the army. I hope the government has got through with appointing commanders and sacrificing the lives of our brave men to test their ability.
If the government should send around a company of sharpshooters and shoot 3/4 of the officers, it would do more towards putting down the rebellion than anything. Joel Glover.
While some questioned the leadership, others were anxious to engage in battle and to help bring the rebellion to an end.
I wanted to have one genuine fight before I returned home. I was not satisfied with the fight we had at Fairfax Courthouse when General Jeb Stuart attempted to capture us on that December night. Calvin Richardson, 13th Vermont.
Even though the soldiers of the Second Vermont Brigade had not engaged in a major battle, they had witnessed the devastation of war on many occasions.
There is a family about a half-mile from here in a miserable old house, not near as comfortable as one of our shanties. They are almost in a starving condition. People in Vermont can form no accurate idea of the awful ravages of war upon the inhabitants. Corporal Clark.
The winter of 1862-63 was unusually cold and snowy for Virginia. In addition to the weather, sickness and disease took a heavy toll on the brigade. Typhoid fever, measles, pneumonia, and dysentery ran rampant.
I recollect the old camps and what occurred at them very well. Some of them loved, and some we hated. The hospitals at Camp Fairfax Courthouse and Wolf Run Shoals were filled with the sick, and many of our comrades died from fever, measles, and the diseases incident to Army life. Samuel W. Benjamin, 13th Vermont.
I was happy to leave this miserable camp of Wolf Run Shoals, but we had a hard time here. Many were down sick, hospital full all the time, and many sick remained in the company tents and were taken care of by their tent mates. Corporal Eli T. Marsh.
Sickness was not the only misery that plagued the soldiers.
Most of the boys were sick and many had the measles, and here too, some boy begun to itch and scratch and on looking over themselves, found body lice in their person and in the seams of their blouses and shirts and drawers, and it was a hard job getting rid of them. There was a comrade, an old man on the Company K by the name of Sunderland. That was a washwoman for the regiment, and he knew how to fix the busy crawling graybacks, as we call them. And so we hired him to wash and kill the graybacks in our clothing, and in this way we were soon rid of them.
Soldiers were not the only victims. Hall Woodward, aged 17, a drummer boy with the 13th Vermont, died of typhoid fever at Fairfax Courthouse on January 19, 1863. He left his parents and 5 sisters to mourn his loss. Most of the bodies of those who died in camp were sent home by the companies which they belonged. However, Hiram C. Wolcott of Morristown requested burial at Fairfax Courthouse, Virginia, because his wife could not bear to see him dead.
William Burgess of Company K died March 24th at Wolf Run Shoals. At his request, he was buried in a little pine grove just beyond the hospital. He was an orphan boy and had no relatives. Was born in England and had no home or friends. He was the only one of our regiment buried in this camp. Others who died were sent home. No marble slab or stone ever marked his resting place, nor has his comrade or friend visited the narrow house that still holds his remains.